Please remember, the views expressed on Albertans in Space by our guests and hosts alike are opinions and do not represent the entire industry as a whole. Our podcast serves only as a platform, and all topics discussed are primarily for educational purposes only.
Space. The infinite expanse. Humanity has pushed beyond our atmosphere to understand what calls us to it. The desire to deepen our knowledge of our universe and our home. We go to space to better our world and ourselves. Space technology is constantly improving, and the data we collect with it has never been more valuable. Wyvern is developing this technology in Alberta, opening up unique opportunities to lead the Canadian Prairie region into the space sector and foster a space workforce pipeline in the province. Wyvern's technology is game-changing for applications of satellite data across many sectors, better understanding the status of the environment, agriculture, ecology, and natural resources across the planet. Astronaut Krista McAuliffe said, "Space is for everybody. It's not just for a few in science or math or for a select group of astronauts. That's our new frontier out there, and it's everybody's business to know about space. It's everybody's business to make life down here better. And Wyvern is making it our business. We're building the future of Earth observation. Learn how at wyvern.space.
Welcome to Albertans in Space, the series where we talk to Albertans making waves in the local and global space industry. In today's episode, we invite Chris Robson, CEO and co-founder of Wyvern, as he explains to us what Earth observation is, how it benefits humanity, and how Wyvern's innovative aerospace technology has helped put Alberta on the map in the global space industry. I'm your host, Zach Trolley.
And I'm your lovable co-host and space cadet, Megan Westelmajor. Zach, What do you say when you want to start a fight in space?
I don't know.
Come at me, bro. That one's for the kids.
All right. Albertans in Space is filmed in the city of Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. This land, traditionally called Mohkinstsis, belongs to many nations and people who make their home here. We honor the traditions taught to our elders and acknowledge the generosity of Mother Earth and to take care of our land as humanity expands to new worlds.
You know, Zach, it's a bit bananas that before humanity had the ability to take images of the Earth using satellites, we really didn't have any proof of what the Earth looked like.
Can you imagine navigating with hand-drawn maps and just trusting the Earth was round?
You're asking a lot of me right now. I would not know how to do that.
So ancient civilizations like the Greeks knew back then that the Earth was round. Aristotle wrote in his book On the Heavens that by observing the lunar eclipse, he noticed the shadow of the Earth moving across the moon while in rotation, and therefore the Earth must be a sphere. And about 100 years later, philosophers calculated the circumference of the Earth using sundial technology. I mean, it sounds crazy, but it's just grade school geometry, so, give it a try at home.
When I was learning about exploration in school and heard about Columbus sailing his ships across the world, and those who were on land could see the ship slowly disappearing from view, I'm sure that was a crazy experience. And they were like, "Where did the ship go?
They're just eaten by all
Have
those...
they capsized?
By the sea monsters? Or watching the ships, sink into the ocean was probably a dead giveaway that the Earth was round. But it wasn't until the dawn of aviation, when we could take pictures of the Earth's surface from high altitudes, that we could begin to see the curvature of the Earth. On December 30th, 1930, Captain Albert W. Stevens of the U.S. Army Air Corps took a photograph from an airplane of the East Andes while flying at an altitude of 6.4 kilometers. This photograph was featured in the May 1931 issue of the National Geographic.
I also heard that Earth is not exactly a sphere.
No.
It's not flat, everyone. No. The equator bulges out a bit because of the Earth's rotation. Is that
It
true?
does. Yeah. Also, differences in the geology and gravity can change, the Earth's circumference and where it bulges. Pro tip, if you're going to be fact checking us and looking up the Earth's bulge, be very, very careful of your search terminology when you do this. I know from experience. The first time we saw Earth from space was actually in October 1946. Scientists at the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico placed a camera on top of a captured German V-2 ballistic missile. Also, if you're ever in the White Sands Missile Range, the sands are super, super white. It's really cool. Anyway, the V-2 passed the Kármán line and reached an altitude of about 104 kilometers.
Can you explain what a Kármán line is?
Yeah, it is the official boundary between our atmosphere and space. So it's 100 kilometers from sea level. Now, the film did survive, and we got our first glimpse of the Earth from space. It was an all right photo, black and white. You could just barely make out portions of the Earth.
So you're saying that the missile in 1946 was the first satellite?
Well, not quite. It takes more than being in space to be a satellite. You have to be in orbit. Sputnik was the first artificial satellite in 1947, but didn't have cameras on it. So in August 1959, NASA launched the Explorer 6, and it took the first photographs of Earth from orbit, our very first satellite images.
And how was it?
By modern standards, terrible. The photograph lacked detail. It was kind of a flurry of white lights. In fact, it would take humanity a few more satellite launches before we could produce any images of any sort that would be used for Earth observation.
Earth observation, which is what our episode is about.
So weird. You came all the way around. Good for us.
Full circle, like the Earth.
Ooh. Wyvern CEO Chris Robson will be joining us today to tell us all about it.
On April 2023, Edmonton-based Wyvern successfully launched its first satellite, Dragonet 001, as part of a mission employed by SpaceX. This was an incredible milestone for the Edmonton-based company. Prior to the launch, Wyvern's orbital hyperspectral imaging technology had generated significant buzz and attention. The launch solidified Wyvern's position in the international space industry as a company to be reckoned with. While a lot of other companies typically launch demonstrator satellites, Wyvern's Dragonet 001 was fully operational. Since then, Wyvern has gone on to launch additional satellites in the Dragonet series. It's a cool name. Before co-founding Wyvern, Robson was a mechanical engineering student who, like many Albertans, found themselves interning in the oil and gas sector. As fate would have it, in 2011, Robson would find himself tuning into a Facebook live stream from NASA. This experience gave Robson the push he needed to shift his interest to aerospace technology. With the collaboration of his co-founders, Wyvern was born in 2018. Since then, a small but mighty startup has successfully raised over $17.5 million and has grown to have 31 full-time employees.
Wyvern is a great Alberta success story and a rising star in the global space industry.
We already know that satellites influence our daily lives significantly. Once they were just on top of our roofs, giving us better TV channels. Now we can connect to each other globally, instantly. Last year I was camping in Drumheller and I got to see the Starlink, series of perfectly timed satellites going across the big sky of Alberta.
There, yeah.
And I was horrified, excited, and mostly impressed that I could get internet just like that in Drumheller in the middle of nowhere. What is pretty impressive about satellites is that it's given us the ability to monitor weather and potentially hazardous imminent threats like extreme flooding, forest fires, for which Alberta has been seeing a lot of lately over the last few years.
Yes.
Zach, is there anything that satellites cannot do?
Well, they can't host a podcast and they can't, emote emotionally. We need astronauts like Chris Hadfield to sing Space Odyssey for us from the International Space Stations. Well,
technically he would be.
I guess technically, yeah, he was in space. He was a satellite, so he was doing that. I guess he could host a podcast. Okay, never mind. Anyway, moving on. We want to welcome Chris Robson to the podcast. Welcome, Chris, to Albertans in Space. Thank you much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
And to kick things off, I want to hear about the NASA stream that you were watching that propelled you into space. What was it about?
Oh boy, that really takes me back. So it was 2011. It was July. I was watching the last launch of the space shuttle program. It was the Space Shuttle Atlantis. And I'd never seen a rocket launch before. I was just on my break. I was working for an oil and gas company. I was looking for something to do. And I was scrolling through Facebook. I only had 15 minutes. And I saw this thing. It said, watch the live stream of the last space shuttle launch. And I clicked on it. And when I watched it, it was like a little fire erupted inside of me. It was really, really awesome. Right after that, I said, I don't want to do oil and gas anymore. I really want to do space.
So actually, that's the interesting, moment of that spark, that ignition. What was it like moving from oil and gas into aerospace? What was that transition like?
It wasn't a big transition, partly because at the time, one, we didn't really have an aerospace industry here. So I wasn't exposed to a lot of space culture that you would have been exposed to if you said went to go intern at NASA. The folks that I was working with, they were at the University of Alberta. Some of them had exposure to space, but it was still very much, it was very Albertan culture at the university. And to be honest, a lot of things that we were doing for satellites were very similar to what I was doing in the oil and gas industry, which was I was an engineering intern working for a company building MWDs, measurement while drilling tools, for downhole. And so, there a lot of the subsystems for satellites were the same. There was power, there was communication, there was a battery. It was a different environment and also a different philosophy. It wasn't as big of a leap as you might think it would be.
So the fundamentals between the two are similar.
I think they are myself. I would just say that really the cultures are different, as well as the level of risk, the level of willingness to take risk. One of the things I think that was really interesting working in oil and gas is, for them, they didn't want to risk losing a day of production because that meant millions of dollars of lost revenue. In space, nobody wanted to risk losing a spacecraft because historically it meant losing taxpayer money, or it meant, losing something that you worked for years on and you don't really have another chance. So the risk tolerance was interesting.
So where does the name Wyvern come from? Tell us a bit about why you started this company with you and your co-founders.
Oh, so the name Wyvern, when I was in university, I always used to have a side project. And I was not very good at naming things. And so what I would do is, instead of calling it Project 1 or Project 2, I would work on something. I would call it Wyvern until either something happened with it and I gave it a real name, or something didn't happen to it and I just threw it in the trash bin. And so when we started Wyvern, we were talking to one of our very first partners. He's the CEO of a company called Skywatch out of Ontario. His name is James Sleafers, and we were talking, and he's like, "Oh yeah, all right. So we're excited to do business with you folks. But what do we call you? We can't just call you Chris's bunch of engineers. You need to have a name." And I said, "Oh, just call us Wyvern, and we'll change it later when people, if we're successful." And then people just really liked it.
There you go. I think that's exactly how the X Prize was named. It was going to put something there, but they never meant to, and it just stuck as X Prize. So you're in good company when you're naming philosophy.
Cool. I find that when you give something a name, you tend to associate something with a name as opposed to look at something and go, "Oh yeah, that's definitely a this."
Right.
Oh, I thought it was completely purposeful, because when I Googled Wyvern, it was like a beautiful dragon showed up on my screen. And I'm like, that must have been the origin. But I like your story better.
I do
it
love
chose
dragon.
you. The name chose you. And so why did you start the company?
Oh, so there's a couple of reasons. First and foremost, personally, I was looking for a way to build a space industry in Alberta. And this goes back to when we were working on the satellite project in university. We really wanted to build a space industry here because we wanted to live and work here. But there wasn't a chance to do that. There wasn't a space industry here. And if you wanted to go, you couldn't go work for SpaceX or any of the US space companies because you had to have citizenship or a green card. And that left going out east to Ontario and Quebec, or there's a few smaller things in British Columbia. And so after the Alberta Sat project, I really wanted one of the goals I had was to spin out a space company to start here in Alberta. So that was a personal goal. But the goal that my co-founders and I were really attracted to is we wanted to do something good for Earth from space. We wanted to do something good with our skills because we just went and spent all this time getting these skills and building spacecraft. But we also really had to have a pretty big appreciation of the environment and especially the beauty of Alberta and all of our natural resources here. And so we were looking at the market and we saw that there was a big need for hyperspectral, but we also saw that there was a big application for hyperspectral in climate change monitoring. And the things just came together really nicely.
Can you explain what hyperspectral means?
Oh, yeah. So we sell hyperspectral images. And from a scientific perspective, hyperspectral is measuring wavelengths of light, but you're measuring them very finely. And so if you think about the visible light that you and I see, whereas a camera might do RGB, a hyperspectral camera might capture 30 different colors in that single visible wavelength. So hyperspectral, by its scientific definition, is measuring contiguous bands of light across a spectrum, whereas multispectral is you're measuring non-contiguous bands. So things that are, there's some area between two bands that you're not taking any color measurements. Now, from a practical perspective, like that doesn't mean anything to my grandma, for example, when I'm talking to her. So the explanation I usually go with is this. Imagine you're staring down on Earth from an airplane. You and I see forests, we see mountains, we see rivers, and we can tell what they are. We know what a forest looks like from the air. But if you could see with hyperspectral cameras, you wouldn't just see a forest. You would see, or hyperspectral eyes, you wouldn't just see a forest. You would see the species of tree. You would see how much water content is available in all the vegetation. You would see if there's a pine beetle infestation. You would be able to quantify the risk of wildfire. If you're looking at a farmer's field, you would be able to see the amount of nutrient available in the soil and in the plant. What you're essentially doing with hyperspectral is you're not just taking a pretty picture, you're actually measuring the chemistry, the chemical makeup, material, you're measuring the material, you're identifying objects based off the chemicals and the molecules that they're made out of using light. That's what hyperspectral is.
It's basically superhero X-ray vision times 1,000.
Yeah, it's a bit more advanced than just taking pictures then.
It's a little bit more advanced than just taking pictures. Fundamentally the same mechanisms. It's just we're splitting light into a lot more.
So let's take a step back and kind of explain, for our listeners here, what the Earth observation industry is, and why are we looking at Earth in the first place?
For sure. So the Earth observation industry is an industry that uses You could say just space, but it's not really just space. It's also airplanes and drones and certain balloons. Essentially, we're using payloads and instruments that are positioned remotely to look back on Earth and take measurements about the spatial characteristics, the temporal characteristics, the spectral characteristics of Earth. And we're using that to gain some sort of insight that helps us in our day-to-day lives. The most common, the most familiar example is probably weather. We use a lot of weather satellites for everybody's daily weather forecast. One of the cool apps I have on my computer, it's called Uplink, but it allows you to see every 20 minutes the NOAA satellites. They beam down an image of Earth, and you can choose which section of the Earth you want to see. So mine is positioned over Alberta, but you can see every 20 minutes how the cloud changes, the smoke patterns change. You can see, different colors based off of how dry or how wet things are. But we use things like that all the time just for weather.
Right.
And it's such a big impact on multiple industries along with their day-to-day lives.
So if I'm sitting in Calgary, then I can log on to these websites using NOAA, using Wyvern, using whoever, and I can get data for any industry, right? I mean, you're talking about, crop health, you're talking about forest management. Like how widespread is this technology? Like if I go downtown Calgary, is it like common to be interacting with these things?
Oh, so it's used in any industry that involves a remote asset or a large area of land that you have to manage. So agriculture, forestry, energy, mining, military and defense is the biggest industry in Earth observation for obvious reasons. Climate, insurance, finance. Finance is especially interesting because you can use it for commodities trading. there's a lot of our Earth observation applications in the marine industry. So, for example, tracking the location of different of boats, both for safety reasons, for commodity trading reasons. There's so many applications that you and I don't really get exposed to on a daily basis, but they permeate almost every industry.
So they're pretty important here. We're saying this is an important industry.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you look back at the start of environmentalism, it was also the start of when humans started going to space and looking back on Earth. Like looking at Earth is one of the things that made us realize, oh crap, like this is Earth is the only one we got, and it's a beautiful and amazing place, but it's also, a very small location in the universe. We should take care of it. But a lot of environmental monitoring comes from Earth observation.
So I mean, we're talking about like seeing ourselves in the mirror and understanding who we are as humans.
Yeah.
Chris, are you a poet as well as a company CEO?
If I am a poet, I'm not a very good one.
We kind of broached the subject before we started talking to you, but of course, Alberta has been facing a lot of extreme weather. So, what are your satellites doing to help gather knowledge about how wildfires can be tracked better, stopped? Is there flood mitigation measures that can be learned from the satellites that you've put in orbit?
There is, absolutely. And we have our first satellite just started producing imagery in the last week of April. What we are planning to do with the satellite images, specifically for Alberta, is we're working on being able to map out the amount of fuel in forests and turn that into a map of risk that says, hey, the risk of a wildfire in this location is really high, this one's really low. There's a lot of things that go into that. Because we can see things like tree species, certain tree species are a lot more vulnerable to wildfire than others. Certain tree species have pine beetles, pine trees. But anyway, we can see pine beetle infestations, and you can see how much water content is in the forest, and to some extent in the soil as well. You can all turn this into a map that says, hey, this is where we think you should position your resources ahead of the season, because there's probably going to be a wildfire here. And when it comes to wildfires, at least take this with a grain of salt, because I'm not a wildfire fighter myself, but I understand that one of the biggest factors in success is time, the amount of time it takes to respond. It's being able to respond to something when it's very small versus, when it's the size of the one that just took Jasper was like, it's really hard to fight a fire like that. And another thing that our satellites can do is they can also look at the post-burn effects of wildfire. And sometimes that's for awareness. You want to see how big of an area a wildfire is taken out. Sometimes there's an industrial reason as well, though. So, for example, if you're managing if you're in a forestry management zone in Alberta, and a wildfire just went right through it, you've only got a certain amount of time that you have to really recover any burnt wood, and you might want to know the quality of that wood before you go and try to harvest it. Anyway, that's what for wildfire. That's what we're looking at. For things like for flood risk, though, one of the great things about hyperspectral, because you can see water content, at least at the surface of the soil as well as in the vegetation, you can start turning that into flood mitigation maps. Because if you see a watershed that's just like full of water, you're like, okay, well, the soil's not going to absorb as much water if it rains all of a sudden, so there might be a flash flood here.
So basically, you're able to kind of peer down and get a view of the entire city, the entire province, the entire world of what's going on?
Essentially, yeah. The goal is to eventually be able to take an image anywhere on Earth on a sub-daily basis.
Okay, that's a lot of information.
The amount of forward thinking, I used to say that the weatherman was the only fortune teller that we follow religiously. But I can honestly say that the technology has gotten to the point where I believe in it. And I believe that preventing these extreme weather patterns before they happen, or predicting these extreme weather patterns before they happen is key to protecting our vital resources here on Earth. So you're doing great work.
It's amazing stuff, and I can only imagine the journey you've been on. Can you tell us a little bit about starting your company and working here in Alberta, like you said, there wasn't an industry, and now you've created an industry. You've got employees, and you've built it up. What has that journey been like?
Oh, it's been, we like to call it riding the dragon, which is a colorful way of saying it's been a roller coaster. Starting off, so myself, my co-founders, Kristen, Callie, and Curtis, we all started off actually part-time, just I was just finishing up my master's degree. I know Curtis was still was just finishing up some work. I know that Kristen and Callie were both still at university as well, and we just had this idea. We decided to jump on it, and the very first thing we did, and this is one of the reasons I actually really like having started Wyvern in Canada and in Alberta especially. So we actually got our start by applying for a grant through the Alberta government called GreenSTEM, which allowed us to, me and Curtis, or at least two of us, to work full time for 2 years, and to also have a little bit of money that we could use to either hire an employee or spend money on a 3D printer or some materials or something to prototype our technology. The very early years were interesting because we were completely new to the startup scene and we had no idea what we were doing. We got into creative destruction labs, which was absolutely wild. We met Chris Hadfield. My current CTO, she was our mentor at Creative Destruction Labs. The first few years were us hard at work trying to figure out what we wanted to do, how to make it happen, and also doing some early prototyping. Like I said, it was a bit of a roller coaster. There were definitely times. I think maybe one of the disadvantages to starting in Alberta without a space industry is that there's certain lessons that you only learn by doing it. And if you're in a place where they've already got people who've done this, you can go talk to them about what they've done and they can warn you about what not to do. And well, it was a little harder to do that for us at first because of where we were, but we made it work. We won some grants, we won some contracts, and we slowly started building up a business. We did our first fundraise actually just about 3 years ago this summer.
Congratulations.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
Great milestones. There must have been challenges to starting the company and seeing the growth. If you had to give advice to someone who wanted to start their own space company, what would you say?
Now that you're the expert.
Oh
yeah,
my gosh.
you're now the expert.
Well, I've got one sample point, but one of the biggest mistakes especially a lot of technical founders will make when they start their first company is they'll focus on the technology instead of on the customer. I would say at the beginning, we did a good job of focusing on the customer, but we didn't do enough. We interviewed a bunch of customers, but we also didn't go back to them and say, hey, if we created this product, would you buy it from us? There were there was a lot of customer development things that we should have focused a lot more of our time on. The other thing that I would recommend anybody starting their own space company to do, and sorry, this second point touches the first point. If you want to start a company in any industry, really, you've got to be investable. And what does that mean? It means that you have something that people want and they're willing to buy, and something that you need proof to do that. One of the hardest things about starting a space company, and the place where a lot of space companies have died, is that you can't really sell something until you put something in space, but you can't convince investors to invest in you until you sell something, unless you've already got a long history of building successful companies and getting a return from investors. So it was very difficult for us to raise money at first. And we had to, because we went out going, oh, well, we got this great idea. Why won't anybody invest in us? And it finally took one of our mentors. She sat us down and said, look, guys, I got to be honest with you. You guys aren't investable right now. And we were like, well, what do you mean? And she's like, well, you got this great idea, but you don't have any contracts. You don't even have any letters of intent that say how much somebody's going to buy something from you for. And we took that and we went to town with it. We got our first contract. It was over $1 million, and that really helped us. But we were very close to, at that point, we were very close to throwing in the towel because we had no idea why we weren't being successful fundraising. I would say another thing that you should keep in mind when you're starting your first space company is that it's very tempting to try to boil the entire ocean. because you see people like SpaceX do this. SpaceX is completely vertically integrated. They're building all their own parts. I don't know very many suppliers that supply stuff to SpaceX, but SpaceX has a incredibly large treasury that they can throw this stuff at, and they've also been doing this for almost 20 years now. Space entrepreneurs, when you just get started the first time, you can't do that. So I would recommend taking a very close look at why you want to build your own spacecraft and build your own payload and build your own data analytics, or if you're doing I would just really heavily recommend that people who start their company the first time look at the key thing that they want to be different, that they want to differentiate themselves, and just focus on that and outsource the other things. The only reason to outsource otherwise is because it gives you some sort of economic advantage to not outsource, or because you just can't get what you need from your supplier.
You talked a little bit about the Green STEM grant being pretty vital to Wyvern. Can you tell us a little bit more about it, and who is it available to?
Yes. So the great thing about the Green STEM, so most grants in Canada, they will typically require that you fund at least 25%. At least 25% of the grant, and then they'll give you 75% for whatever project you're trying to fund. The really novel thing about the Green STEM grant is that you didn't have to do that. All you needed to do, and at the time it was primarily about building up sustainability and green technologies. For us with hyperspectral, it was environmental monitoring, but it was also particularly methane emissions monitoring. The key thing about it that was really different from other grants was that it gave us, it wasn't a big paycheck. It was really small, like barely above what you make as a university grad student, but enough that you and, one of your co-founders could go and do this full time for 2 years. And then it also gave you a little bit of seed money, but it did not require you to have that outside investment come in. That was really key. Without that, I'm not sure that we would have made it. At the very least, we would have had to raise money from angel investors, which I do wish we did earlier, but that's really another story.
So it gave you kind of the runway to get started and build that base that you were able to then, like you said, go forward and get contracts and talk to customers.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the time, I was actually thinking that I would be, trying to do a PhD at the same time, which because it was money, and I could potentially do my PhD on what I was trying to do with Wyvern, but it would have been a very small amount of money. And it also wouldn't have allowed me to do Wyvern full time. This allowed me to do Wyvern full time. It was absolutely pivotal for us. So I think I'm actually not sure if it's still an active program, which is too bad if it's not. But it was largely available to folks that had graduated within the last 5 years from a STEM degree program and a master's and PhD. They wanted to fund things that had emissions reduction potential. I think at the time for us, it was like $40,000 in salary for per person for 2 years, and then it was like $100,000 that you just spend on whatever you want.
That's so cool to be able to do that, though. Even though it's a minimal amount of money, it kind of puts you into that position of working in space where you were inspired to work in. We're talking about you being an Alberta success story in the space world, so we're really happy to chat with you today. I want to know more about the Dragonet launch, and what was it like to see the satellite go into orbit, and what was it like working with SpaceX, because that's they're kind of a success story in and of themselves.
So we never actually ended up working with SpaceX ourselves. Our satellite supplier, AAC Clyde Space, they built the satellites for us, and they operate them right now too. They're the ones that worked with SpaceX, got everything set up, got it packaged up in the launch vehicle, and we got to go and see the launch. And the launch was incredibly cool. So like the SpaceX would invite you to this reception the night before, and they'd have all these like space themed candies, and you got to meet everybody else who was going up in the rocket, and then you would go out to this. Essentially, it was a giant tent that they'd set up, but with like they actually had Starlink internet there, which is cool, but also like big TVs, and you were right across from the launch pad. It was really And the thing I remember the most is that the day was so clear, and it's so rare for a rocket launch. Having such a clear day that you can see the rocket, like as far as the burners will allow you to see on a sunny day, you could see that rocket going. And then to watch that thing come down and land itself was absolutely out of this world, especially because it landed and then you heard it, and it was just wild. Like the sonic boom on that thing just blew me away.
So, Chris, have you considered that your space journey started with watching a live stream launch, and the launch of your rocket? Somebody could have watched that and then started their own space journey watching your SpaceX launch?
I hadn't considered that before, but I hope that was the case.
That you're inspiring the next generation with your work?
I hope so. At the end of the day, that's what I want to do.
Tell us about the future of Wyvern. What is on the horizon for your team?
Well, we've got, by the time this airs, we should have a 4th satellite up, but we should also have another 2 going up in 2025. And that's going to put our total DragonNet constellation at 6. And then we just got this amazing grant from Emissions Reductions Alberta. It's going to help us launch our next generation satellite. And our next generation satellite is going to be able to help us detect things like methane emissions, do a lot more serious analysis when it comes to wildfire management. And it's also going to open up a lot of the mining industry for us, because it's going to a whole new wavelength of light, and the resolution is going to surprise people. It's going to be really awesome.
Is it 4K?
I actually don't know. It's a good question.
How large are the images that you're taking?
Oh
from the
boy.
satellite?
I believe each of the images that we're downloading today are about, I want to say between 600 megabytes and a gigabyte.
Per image?
Per image, yeah.
Well, that's pretty big.
That's a manageable amount, though.
These
the
days.
ones that we're going to be putting up in the later generations are going to be definitely in the multi-gigabyte.
So this is a lot of data. This is some heavy data stuff here.
So what is the next generation satellite going to be called?
Well, we're not entirely sure yet. We've called it Generation 2. We did some polling and we did a vote, and it turns out that the one we picked is a brand used by one of the other satellite companies out there. So we're still trying to figure it out.
Well,
we're still working on it.
Zach and Megan, I think, are still open for names if you want to name it that. That's fair.
I have a unique last name, Westall Major. You're welcome to have it.
The Westall Major constellation? Yeah. That sounds pretty good.
For 25% of the company.
Yeah.
Oh boy. Well, that's probably going to be our top 1 or 2 choice. I'll have to get back to you.
Going to workshop that and get back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Chris, here we have our little our book club thing. Do that. So we have a book club here on the show, and we like to ask our guests to tell us about a book that's been impactful in their life or in their journey, fiction, nonfiction, new, old. What have you brought for us today?
So the book that I really like is a book called Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. So Jocko Willink, he's a former Navy SEAL, and he talks about leadership lessons he learned while fighting in Iraq as part of the SEAL teams, and he translates those into lessons for leaders. He's got a consulting practice that he runs to teach the same leadership principles to business.
And I was looking at it, and I think one of the things that stuck out to me was to bury your ego and not to be a team player. And a theme that's gone throughout the podcast is that space is hard, and that it's a team sport. Have you encountered that in your space journey?
Oh yeah, like I would not have been where I am today if I didn't have an amazing team behind me. Like at the end of the day, like sure, I'm a reasonably smart guy, but the real secret is I've got really smart people working for me that are, really amazing at their jobs, and are really committed to the same sort of vision that we've put forward. Without this team of people, this wouldn't have happened. Not by a long shot.
I think
teams are really important.
That's a really great leader comment to make. So I love that a lot. That's great.
I'm a nice talking head with a beautiful chin, but that's about it.
That's important too. Everyone has their role. That's not to be downplayed at all. Excellent. Well, thank you, Chris. Thanks for joining us on our podcast, and we look forward to seeing the amazing thing that Wyvern is going to be doing in the future.
Thank you. It was great to be here, and have a good rest of the day.
We want to thank Chris Robson for joining us today to share with us his success story with Wyvern and the incredible work Wyvern is doing in our province. If you'd like to follow or learn more about Wyvern, you can go to their website at wyvern.space. Props to Sandra Lynn for her writing research efforts, Nick, our sound engineer, 6 Degrees Music and Sound, Dan, our DOP camera, and Kristen, our behind-the-scenes photographer, for helping us make this podcast sound and look amazing. Next time on Albertans in Space, we speak with award-winning Calgary concept artist Brian Versteeg about the crucial role of the human imagination when it comes to designing future habitats and technologies in space.
Thank you so much for watching Albertans in Space. We hope you enjoyed the show today. Please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and give us a like. We appreciate your support. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at albertansinspace_podcast. That's all for today.
See you next time.
See ya.